Hey everybody, welcome back to DRTV. Above the pay grade, Brian and I are joined by, or with, would it be by or with, Brian? By. That's the doctorate, the non-doctorate. We figure, well, another doctor's in the room. Ryan Anderson. Thanks for joining us, Ryan.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be with you.
Ryan wrote the book, Truth Overruled, The Future of Marriage and Religious Freedom. And I suggest you buy it. You can get it everywhere. Didn't you say it was number 5 on the top seller list? Washington Post?
The Washington Post bestsellers. Yep, it debuted at number 5.
Well, fantastic.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Ryan.
You want to get this, and we're going to talk
Thank
about
you.
this book right now. Brian.
Well, Ryan, you are the William E. Simon Senior Fellow at the Heritage Foundation. You are probably well known to most of our viewers as one of the most articulate defenders of traditional marriage, which is kind of odd because you look pretty young to be defending traditional marriage. Tell us a little bit about how that happened.
Way too hip with the orange, the gingham shirt, and the...
How did you become the champion of traditional marriage in our culture?
Sure.
I mean, how did that happen?
Well, I'm going to tweak you to start and just say it's marriage, not traditional marriage.
Fantastic.
I think
Explain.
We fall prey to the other side in saying that what we're trying to protect is a traditional form of marriage. We're protecting the truth of what marriage is. At least I am. But what I try to do in this new book is to say that marriage isn't kind of a choose-your-own-adventure novel in which you can just reshape it according to human whim. That marriage has a nature. There's an essence to marriage based upon human nature. And so based upon what we are as human beings, created male and female, marriage itself has a nature. And it's the union of a man and a woman who can unite as one flesh. The Hebrew Bible there is not simply saying something that's poetic. It's revealing something true about mankind at the physical and the metaphysical level, that a man and a woman who unite in that marital act truly become one flesh, so much so that 9 months later it might require a name. So that the marital act that unites a man and a woman as husband and wife also makes them mother and father. So I got involved in this because I realized that kids need a mom and a dad. So that, kind of concludes that syllogism, is to say that I was an undergraduate at Princeton when most of the same-sex marriage debate really started, and my classmates couldn't even understand where people who defended marriage between a man and a woman were coming from. They thought it was just bigotry, it's just ignorance, it's just hatred, it's just animosity. And I thought that was ridiculous. I was like, look, you can disagree with half of the country. At that point, it was in more than half of the country who thinks marriage is a union of a man and a woman. But the idea that you can't even understand what they're getting at, where they're coming from, is, it strikes me as that's the really crazy thing here. So I set to work to trying to help them understand. This is the second book I've written. It's the first single author book. I had previously written a book with Sharif Girgis, a classmate of mine at Princeton, and Robbie George, a professor of ours. And that earlier book was just defending the idea that marriage is a union of a man and a woman. This new book is really saying, what do we do now? The title, Truth Overruled. What do we do after the Supreme Court has overruled the truth about marriage to defend and promote a bright future for marriage and for religious freedom?
I know Brian was sitting here going, let's see, the first question we're going to ask Ryan is this over? Is all hope lost?
Isn't it over? This is Ryan. You're looking like Don Quixote here. Okay, you're all dressed up in your shining armor. Aren't you just tilting at a windmill? Defend yourself.
Sure. I mean, that sort of a question. I know you're playing devil's advocate. That's exactly what the talking heads said 42 years ago after Roe v. Wade. They said, look, it's over. You lost. The Supreme Court said there's a constitutional right to abortion. All of the young people are in favor of abortion. Pro-life politicians have evolved to become pro-choice. Bill Clinton and Al Gore and Jesse Jackson and Ted Kennedy were pro-life Democrats who evolved in office, became pro-choice. They said, look, you've lost. The last pro-lifers on the face of the earth will be in geriatric nursing homes and inside the four walls of the Vatican. That was the argument back then. And today, my generation's more pro-life than my parents' generation. There's no reason to think that with a little effort and some devotion that we can't help explain to people the truth about marriage and why it matters. It's only after 40 years of a cultural redefinition of marriage that comes out of the 60s, that comes out of the sexual revolution, that Anthony Kennedy can legally redefine marriage. The problem here is that that cultural redefinition and the legal redefinition get marriage wrong, and they cause negative consequences. So, our task now is to bear witness to the truth and to do what we can to restore a strong marriage culture in the United States. And it's not just the same-sex part. If you think about what took place led up to the same-sex part, it was non-marital childbearing. It was high rates of divorce. It was the hookup culture. It was absentee fathers, fatherless families. All of that needs to be addressed. We need to be saying that it's really important for men and women to commit to each other permanently and exclusively as husbands and wives, and for kids to have moms and dads. That's the truth that needs defending and promoting now.
I don't know. I might be kind of an old school traditional Luddite, marital Luddite, or relational Luddite or something over here. But I get okay, it's good for a country to grow its populace. How does that happen? Because science, man, woman, sex, baby. And then there's this institution to help raise this child really, really well. Maybe I'm just freaky over here, but I don't know.
You have not been liberated in your thinking.
That's it.
To get over those sort of heteronormative rules that are constricting your view. You don't understand the nuances of sexual orientation, and that's the next thing I wanted to ask you about.
Yeah, I was going to say,
Ryan.
You're starting to buzz in my ear. We just had a video that Brian and I produced called "Gay Rights Movement versus the Civil Rights Movement," and it's acquired close to 50,000 views now and caused quite a ruckus. But it's about this very question.
Yeah.
Sexual orientation, is that the same as race?
That's a question, Ryan. It seems like everybody wants to make that connection, that sexual identity, how people define their sexual identity, is just like race, and therefore the oppression of people's sexual liberty is identical to racial bigotry and racial oppression that happened in the past. How do you answer that charge?
So a couple of ways. I mean, the first thing is to say there's an entire chapter in the book. It's chapter 6 titled Why Sexual Orientation is Not Like Race. So you can get 30 pages of answer there. But let me give you a couple of thoughts. First is that regardless of what you think about sexual orientation, homosexuality, same-sex relationships, the argument here is that they're simply not marriages. You could be in favor of same-sex relationships and not think they're marital relationships. Plato and Socrates, or Socrates as Plato, seems to have an opinion something like that. That even in a homoerotic culture like Greece, they didn't frown upon same-sex male relationships, but they also didn't think that they were marriages. So even if you take a favorable view on the sexual orientation, same-sex relationship question, you still haven't answered the marriage question of what is a marriage. But then the civil rights analogy and the racism analogy is frequently used when we think about the baker, the florist, and the photographer. And they say, well, you wouldn't allow a racist baker, a racist florist, a racist photographer. Why here? And there are a couple of things to think about. The first point is that Martin Luther King Jr. got it exactly right when he said that his dream was that his children would be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And so this immediately highlights one of the big differences between sexual orientation and race. Race doesn't speak to the content of your character because race isn't an action. And you think about this, from Aristotle through Kant and more or less every great moral thinker has said morality is about human action, not about inaction. And your race doesn't say anything about how you behave, doesn't say anything about the content of your character. Now, however you evaluate sexual choices, we can at least agree that they're the right subject matter for evaluation. And so sexual identity, insofar as that's a cloak for sexual activity, it can't be the same thing as race just because they're different concepts. So regardless of how you evaluate sexual behavior, sexual activity, sexual identity, it's the subject matter that is ripe for evaluation. Whereas race, skin color, that's not ripe for evaluation because it's not even the subject matter that can be evaluated.
Right.
So that's another kind of highfalutin principle on how these things aren't even similar. And it's offensive to very many civil rights leaders to hear the comparison made. I spoke last week in D.C. To a group of black church leaders, and they were expressing to me frustration when they say, it feels like our legacy has been hijacked. The civil rights legacy has been hijacked. Here's another way, and this is just in the sake of time, the one that I'll close with. In the 1960s, when Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964, if you were African American and you were living in the South, there was a real possibility that you would be denied access to a hotel or a hospital or a theater or a restaurant. I mean, there were still segregated lunch counters. The situation today, we're not talking about gays and lesbians being unable to go to a hospital, unable to rent a hotel room, unable to get a pizza. Think about the Indiana situation. It was only the same-sex wedding that they had a concern about. They said they wouldn't cater a same-sex wedding with their pizza, but they said they would have no problem if a gay couple came in and wanted to buy slices of pizza selling them. And so it's a radically different situation. It's also not as if evangelical Christians and conservative Catholics have a monopoly on cake baking and floral arrangements and wedding photography. And so it raises the question: what is the justification?
Haven't they ever seen their own show? What is it? Gay Eye for the Straight Guy?
Queer eye for the straight
Queer Eye
guy.
for the Straight Guy.
It really raises the question: what justifies government in saying every baker, every photographer, every florist needs to do this in a situation when the Supreme Court redefined marriage? Every prominent institution of American life cheered the decision. The White House was in rainbow colors. Uber, if you used the car app that day, the cars had little rainbow exhaust pipes. Every elite institution, universities, Hollywood, law firms, they all were cheering this on. So what justifies the government in coercing, the handful of remaining people who believe the truth about marriage? I just don't see how you can make the comparison that being gay or lesbian in the United States today is like being African American in the South in the 1960s. So anyway, that's a third way in which it's different.
I'm white, but I find it highly offensive on behalf of my black friends. I'm just like, really?
That was really well said.
That
Now
was
you
really
brought
well
up
said.
you brought up the baker, the florist, the photographer. This goes to the concern about religious liberty and religious conscience in this country. And now, of course, in the last couple of weeks, Ryan, we've had the case of Kim Davis, the county court clerk, refusing to issue marriage licenses because she didn't want her name on a same-sex marriage license. There is a very critical question right now about religious liberty and the rights of conscience in our country. You just mentioned that all of the corporate support, all the elite institutions, everybody's on the side of same-sex marriage, including the courts, all the institutions of power. In light of that, can we win the religious liberty issue? Is there hope for the Christian baker, photographer, florist in terms of not participating in same-sex weddings? For that matter, religious schools and institutions keeping tax-exempt status, churches being able to refuse doing same-sex marriages, the whole gamut. Can we win this debate?
Yes, we can, and we have to, because what's really at stake here is the institutional integrity and the witness of these various professionals, and as you mentioned, the schools, the charities, the universities, to be able to live out their faith in the public square, not just Sunday morning at the chapel, but Monday through Saturday, whether it's at the workplace, the school, the educational institution, or the charitable group. They all need to be free to live out their beliefs. Here's how we're going to do it. It's only the ideologues and the activists and the extremists who think that the freedom to marry the person you love, which was the argument used for same-sex marriage, translates into a duty for someone else to bake you a cake or to teach your theology of marriage. Freedom is a two-way street. So if the same-sex couple is free to live and to love how they want to, the evangelical college should be free to live and to teach and to preach and to have sexual codes of conduct how they want to. And the baker and the florist and the photographer should be free to do weddings how they want to. And what's interesting here is I think the more reasonable, the more moderate liberals understand that. And this is the exact parallel to where the pro-lifers were after Roe. There were some abortion extremists who said, Roe v. Wade's the law of the land. Abortion's a constitutional right. Abortion is healthcare like any other healthcare. Every doctor and every nurse and every pharmacist and every hospital should be forced to do abortion. And the abortion extremists lost that. We passed good laws that said pro-life doctors, pro-life nurses, pro-life pharmacists, Catholic hospitals don't have to violate their beliefs about unborn human life. And what we saw was that I had classmates at Princeton who were pro-choice. They said, we disagree with you about abortion, but we understand why you're pro-life, and we will respect your freedom. We have to do the same thing now in marriage. We have to get it so that reasonable liberals can say, I disagree with you about marriage, but I understand why you believe what you believe, and I won't use the government to persecute you. I won't use the government to coerce you, to fine you, to shut down your adoption agencies, to remove your nonprofit tax status. And so the real challenge here is for people like you and me and our viewers right now to be willing to help reach out to their liberal neighbors and say, look, we disagree about this, but I'm coming at it from a good faith perspective. I'm not doing this because I'm like a neo-Nazi. One of the most recent reviews of this book on Amazon has called me a Nazi and said that the title of the book should be Mein Kampf, right? That's the extremist.
That's somebody who didn't read the book, apparently.
That sounds like one of your Twitter followers.
Exactly. And it's so outrageous. It makes you both laugh. It makes reasonable liberals want to distance themselves from that sort of rhetoric. Because they want to say, look, I disagree with you, but I don't think you're Hitler reincarnated. And I don't have to treat your views as if they're Nazi propaganda. And I think that's going to be the real challenge here. And so you ask the question, can we protect religious liberty? I think we can if we're willing to appeal to the reasonableness of people who disagree with us.
You know, your comments strike me that there needs to be something that I want to just promote here, and that's a charitable nature on behalf of Christians who, you know, we believe in what marriage is, and we're going to disagree with it. But what you're saying requires a level of charitableness and charity towards the liberals. And I see a lot of conservatives that are just raging at, oh, these stupid, dumb liberals, they don't know 2 + 2. And it's like, well, no, actually, that's not the case at all. Most of the ones I come in contact with have very legitimate reasons for believing what they believe. They're just coming at it from a different angle. So I wanted to throw that out there to, you know, check yourself when you're at charity.
And let me add something onto that, because if you are a secular liberal and all you've ever heard from Christians is the Westboro Baptist Church, I can't blame them for thinking what they think. If you think the baker, the florist, and the photographer is doing what they're doing because they believe in the Westboro Baptist Church, for viewers who don't know, these are the radicals on the religious right side of the equation that hold up signs at funerals that say, God hates fags. Now, first, that's heresy, because God doesn't hate anyone. And second, that's not even the theology that motivates people on this issue. It's an understanding of what marriage is and the importance of marriage that's motivated the baker, the florist, and the photographer, not hatred. So to take one example, Baronelle Stutzman, 70-year-old evangelical grandmother florist, she's employed gay people. She was selling flowers to this particular gay couple for 10 years. It was only when they asked for the same-sex wedding flowers that she had to politely decline. This isn't because she hates gay people. It's not because God hates gay people. It's because of her belief about what marriage is. And so we have to do a better job of embodying those beliefs and explaining those beliefs, because if all you know is what the Westboro Baptist Church says, I don't blame you for thinking that people like us are dangerous and idiots and evil. Right. I would think the same thing if all I... So it's really incumbent on us to speak for ourselves, because if we go silent, the nature abhors a vacuum, and that Westboro Baptist Church gets a louder microphone, a louder megaphone, if we aren't speaking for ourselves.
Yeah, we will allow the other side to define us by
or the
default.
extremists on our side to define us. I mean, I think that's it's not the other side so much as the Westboro Baptist Church claims to be a Baptist church, and so it's our extremists, in the same way that we want to appeal to reasonable liberals to distance themselves from their extremists. We also need to call out our extremists for being, look, they're just wrong. They are heretical. That belief is heresy. Right. And it's not true, and it's not good, and it's not beautiful. It's not godly.
Thanks, Ryan. I appreciate that word.
Yeah, let me ask you then, and I think you've already touched on it a little bit, but in your book, you have a chapter called The Long View. And I think you might have hinted at it earlier when you brought up Roe versus Wade and the 40-year battle over abortion. These are sort of discouraging times for Christians, conservative Christians of all stripes, people on the political right on this question. These are discouraging times. Obergefell was something of a watershed culturally. This same-sex marriage has been enshrined as a constitutional right. These are discouraging times. How can you encourage people with the long view? What is the long view as you see it?
Great question. I say a couple of things in that last chapter. One is to draw the parallel to Roe v. Wade and just say pro-lifers didn't give up 42 years ago. And the reason why it's relatively easy to be pro-life in America today is because of the hard work that they did 40 years ago and 30 years ago, 20 years ago, and heck, 10 years ago. It's relatively easy to say, I believe in a right to life, and here's why. And it's because people didn't give up back then. And so we have to take the long view. They knew that they weren't going to overturn Roe v. Wade with the next vote of Congress or the next general election, that to build a culture of life would take generations. We have to have the same willingness on this issue to say, to build a marriage culture, we have to undo the past 50 years, not just this one Supreme Court ruling, but it's 50 years of bad cultural practice in Hollywood and TV and movies and universities and court rulings that we have to respond to. But then at the end of the book, I say, let's put this in an even longer, long view. And I say from a Christian's perspective, and this is, at this point in the book, I said, all right, I've done political philosophy for the first 9 chapters of the book. Let me say something from a more confessional vantage point. Mm-hmm. You could think that the heresies of the 20th century all hinge on anthropology. The heresies for the early church were about theology, the nature of God. It was Christology, it was Trinitarian theology. And in the middle of those debates, who knows what's orthodoxy and what's heresy? And it looks like, oh no, the Orthodox might be losing. And then you have people like Augustine and Athanasius and all of these great people who we now view as saints and wonderful theologians who did the hard work of defending orthodoxy. And now we're like, it's obvious. Of course it's a Trinitarian. Of course it's hypostatic union, two natures in one person, fully God and fully man. In the middle of those debates, no one knew how it was going to come out. And it was important that people did the hard work. Take the Middle Ages, Reformation, early Enlightenment. Regardless of whether you're Catholic or Protestant, those debates hinged on soteriology. They hinged on ecclesiology. They hinged on kind of salvation debates. And whether you're Catholic or Protestant, we could all agree that we got richer theologies. We got a better understanding of the truth as a result on both sides. The Reformation, Counter-Reformation, it was a good process overall. Today's debates, they're not about the nature of God. They're not about the nature of salvation. They're about the nature of man. This is an insight I got from John Paul II. And he said, if you look at first, it was all the totalitarian regimes. The Holocaust, the killing fields, totalitarian systems, Stalin, right? He's saying, what is this? It's a misunderstanding of the nature and dignity of man. Communism, socialism views man as a cog for the purposes of the state. And it wasn't recognizing that each and every human being has innate dignity. And then he said the same thing is now taking place with technology. And so whether it's embryo destruction, cloning, abortion, marriage, transgender identity, what's taking place now is the question of our identity. That we're created in the image and likeness of God with innate dignity, that we're created male and female, that male and female are created for each other in marriage. That's the big challenge for the 21st century. And so the long view is going to be, we need lots of people, the theologians and the philosophers, the artists, the musicians, the preachers, the homeschooling moms. We need everyone now to be bearing witness to these truths. In the same way they think about the great artwork, the great music, the great literature that comes out of the early church, that comes out of the medieval church, that comes out of the early modern church. We need all of that now to be defending our humanity. And that's the big crisis right now. It's a question of anthropology.
There's so much in what you said that brings hope. Knowing that our identity is not wrapped up in something like our sexuality or our race or our backgrounds or even our history, if it's, great or abusive. There's because our identity is inherently because of God and how he created us in the image of him. That is where so it doesn't matter what happens to us on the outside. We still have inherent dignity, which is an American principle.
Yeah, it is an American principle, isn't it? That's the Declaration of Independence. That's right. Ryan, that was absolutely fascinating. I appreciate that little history lesson, and I think that you're exactly right that there's a great political scientist, Eric Vogelin, who wrote a little book on Gnosticism, science, and politics, in which he said, talking about the death of God movement in philosophy, he said that that deicide, the murder of God, is always followed by homicide, the murder of man. We've wiped out God, and therefore we're now going to wipe out human identity. And I think that's exactly right. It's all about anthropology these days. So significant intellectual challenges, and I like how you've broadened the orbit of who needs to be involved. It's everybody. It's the filmmaker. It's the songwriter. It's the regular moms and dads. All hands on deck, right, Ryan?
That's the entire think about how the pro-life movement did it. You had the philosophers and the theologians doing why is Peter Singer wrong? Those sorts of arguments. You had the lawyers. Why did the Supreme Court get it wrong? You also had grassroots activists. You had Feminists for Life, Silent No More, Students for Life, Collegians for Life, Women Speak for Themselves. You had crisis pregnancy centers. You had Rachel's Vineyard. You had all sorts of groups, all walks of life, making all sorts of arguments, providing material assistance, comfort and care, and concrete support. Everything the pro-life movement did, there's a corollary to what we can do. Think about the movies. Just within the past 5 or 10 years, you have Knocked Up, you have Bella, you have Juno, you have all sorts. Some of these weren't even intentionally made to be pro-life movies, but they were just telling true stories, and then people saw the pro-life message. What can we do with all of these various new media? You guys are doing a great job with it right now. Of how can we witness to the truth in our generation with the tools at our hands? And everyone has a role in this, whatever their gifts and talents. Every vocation matters.
Wow.
Fantastic.
Take up the banner. Take up the banner. Take up your computer. Order this book, Truth Overruled, by Ryan Anderson. Ryan, where can people get a copy of the book and find out more about you, keep in touch with you and the work you're doing?
Sure. You can get the book at Barnes & Noble. You can order it online on Amazon. You can get it more or less wherever books are sold. If you want, you can follow me on Twitter. That's what my trolls do. It's at Ryan T. and. Hopefully you can defend me from the trolls. I have a public Facebook page. It's, Ryan T. Anderson, PhD. So facebook.com/Ryan T. Anderson, PhD. And that's where I post, articles that I've written. I'll post the link to this interview when it's online.
Oh, great.
TV appearances. I kind of use that as a way of getting all this stuff out there. Because I think my vocation, if you think about, it's to help people think through these questions. And then I want people who have gifts and talents, whether they're playwrights or Hollywood producers or TV, whatever, to use some of these ideas and embody the ideas in art, embody the ideas in novels, embody the ideas in TV, whatever.
All right.
Yeah.
How you win the
so thank you for having me.
Well, Ryan, we began the interview with the rhetorical question, isn't it over? And I think we're ending the interview on the note that not by a long shot. Thank you so much, Ryan, for coming on the show.
Thank you.
If you'd like to find out more about Dead Reckoning and what Brian and I are up to at Dead Reckoning TV and our show DRTV here, you can follow us at deadreckoning.tv, on Twitter at DReckoningTV, and then you can find us on Facebook as well, Dead Reckoning TV. And don't forget to follow Ryan and tell everybody you know about him and his book, Truth Overruled. With that, I'm your host, Jay Friesen.
I'm Brian Mattson.
And this is DRTV.